I stood face to face with my husband, the same man who had thrown me out of our home after believing the lies his son spread about me. He looked at me with arrogance, as if he held all the power. I couldn't help but laugh. Reflection. No, I hadn't wasted time reflecting. Instead, I had come prepared. From my bag, I pulled out divorce papers and handed them to him. He signed them quickly at first, but when he saw the attached documents, his face went pale, and his hands began to tremble. His son Jim, who had been the root of all this, immediately started to panic. The web of lies they had built was finally collapsing. My name is Mary, and I'm 52 years old. I had been married to Brian for just a year when everything began to unravel. We lived with his adult son, Jim, who refused to move out of the house he had grown up in. He claimed it was his mother's home and that he would never leave. I tried to understand, since I had lost my first husband around the same time Jim lost his mother, but his hostility made life unbearable. Jim never missed a chance to belittle me. One evening, as I served dinner, he muttered with disdain that his mother's cooking had been better. His contempt stung, and when I turned to Brian for support, he simply shrugged and told me to stop cooking for Jim. So I did. The next evening, Jim exploded in anger, shouting that since I had married his father, it was my duty to cook for him as well. No matter what I did, it was never enough. His insults worsened, and Brian's refusal to intervene made me feel abandoned. Before we married, Brian had promised me Jim would move out soon, but that was a lie. Jim wasn't struggling financially as Brian claimed. He had inherited a considerable estate from his late mother and wasted it on luxuries, drowning himself in debt. Despite all this, Brian continued to indulge him. In the middle of this chaos, my daughter Emma brought me some good news. She had been proposed to, and her joy lit up my heart. Since my remarriage, moments of happiness had been rare, and hearing this felt like a blessing. I congratulated her warmly, certain her late father would be proud to see her happy. But Emma hesitated when it came to Brian. She admitted she didn't feel the need to introduce her fiancé to him because he wasn't truly a part of her life. I couldn't argue with her honesty. When I told Brian about Emma's engagement, he barely reacted. His indifference no longer surprised me, but it still cut deep. Later, Jim mocked me, saying I should just divorce his father and go live with my daughter. I looked to Brian for support, but he walked away as always. Out of frustration, I asked Jim why he hadn't settled down himself. He gave me only a bitter look before storming off. The idea of Jim marrying and bringing a wife into the house made me shudder, and when I asked Brian what he thought, he coldly replied that it was up to Jim, and he didn't care either way. His indifference had become the constant poison in our marriage. Eventually, I met Emma's fiancé. Brian refused to join me, saying he didn't care and didn't want to be invited to the wedding. In stark contrast, Emma's fiancé was everything Jim wasn't: mature, kind, and responsible. Seeing how he treated Emma with respect and love reassured me. I told her she had chosen well, silently comparing him to Jim and realizing just how much more pathetic Brian's son seemed in comparison. Emma's fiancé looked at me with concern and said gently, "If things don't work out with your husband and his son, you can always come live with us." His words carried a comfort I hadn't felt in years. For once, I felt there was a place I truly belonged. Back at home, however, reality was harsher than ever. Jim greeted me with a sneer, mocking me as though I were just the housekeeper. "Dad and I are starving," he said with contempt. His words cut deep, but what hurt more was Brian's silence. He stood by, pretending not to notice, refusing to defend me. Compared to Emma's fiancé, both Brian and Jim seemed utterly useless, offering nothing but ridicule and indifference. Soon, Brian began disappearing every weekend. His excuse was always the same: helping a friend whose mother was in the hospital. I didn't believe him for a second. When I pressed him and asked if this friend was a woman, his nervous denial only made me more suspicious. The more I doubted him, the more Jim seemed to enjoy it. "Dad probably regrets marrying an old woman like you," Jim sneered. "Maybe he wishes he'd married someone younger. You're going to get cheated on and kicked out." His words struck a nerve because, deep down, I feared they might be true. Then he added, with smug satisfaction, "Why don't you just give up on Dad and leave before things get messy?" That was the breaking point. I realized I couldn't go on living this way, surrounded by lies, disrespect, and the constant suspicion that Brian was planning to replace me with someone else. Just as these thoughts consumed me, Emma called with urgency in her voice. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" Without hesitation, I went. When I arrived, Emma and her fiancé Jack were waiting, both looking uneasy. My heart sank. "Don't tell me you're calling off the wedding," I asked nervously. They shook their heads. "This isn't about us. It's about you," Emma said carefully. Jack pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. "Is this your husband, Brian?" he asked. At first, I didn't recognize him, but then I saw the familiar suit he wore and the young woman clinging to his arm, calling him by name. The photo was taken at a wedding venue, and it was clear from their expressions and conversation that they were planning a wedding of their own. My breath caught in my throat. Brian had no daughters other than Jim, so the woman clearly wasn't family. The crushing truth hit me all at once. My husband was secretly planning to marry another woman while still married to me. Emma leaned closer, studying the photo. "That woman looks far too young to be Jim's girlfriend, doesn't she?" she asked. I confessed to Emma and Jack that I had long suspected Brian of cheating, but I never imagined he would be involved with someone so young. Both of them were shocked as I laid out everything, his excuses about weekends away, his evasive behavior, and my growing doubts. Jack shook his head firmly. "Your husband is awful. We need to make sure he faces the consequences." Emma added with urgency, "Mom, you need to divorce him immediately." I agreed, but I knew we needed undeniable evidence first. Jack immediately began looking into private investigators, assuring me that they would help us get the proof we needed. "Don't worry about your future, Mom," he said warmly. "You can come live with us." For the first time in a long while, I felt supported, and I returned home with a renewed sense of determination. As soon as I walked in, Jim greeted me with the same contempt as always. "You're late. Hurry up and make dinner. Housekeepers shouldn't be out so long." His words burned, but I bit my tongue and quietly made the meal. I refused to let him see me falter. In my mind, I was already planning my escape. Once I had evidence of Brian's affair, I would leave, and then Jim would have to depend on whatever new stepmother Brian brought into the house. I knew he wouldn't be able to treat her the same way he treated me. That night, when Brian came home, I decided to test him. Casually, I asked, "Will you be attending our daughter's wedding?" They've chosen a really prestigious venue, and then mentioned the name I had seen in the photo. For just a second, his face stiffened before he denied knowing the place. His reaction confirmed what I already suspected, but I let it slide, pretending not to notice. Instead, he abruptly shifted the conversation. "Jim hasn't asked you for money, has he? He's been struggling lately." I shook my head. Jim had never once asked me for money, he only saw me as the housekeeper, nothing more. Brian sighed, explaining that Jim had been pestering him for help despite having inherited a large sum from his mother. He admitted that Jim had squandered nearly all of it and was drowning in debt. I thought of the collection letters I had seen stuffed away in Jim's room but chose to keep quiet. I didn't trust Brian enough to confide in him, not when he was likely betraying me behind my back. And I certainly didn't want Jim to know I had discovered his financial mess. "Housekeeper or not, I haven't heard anything about that," I said lightly. Brian pressed further. "Can't you talk to him? Tell him to stop wasting money." I stared at him in disbelief. "Jim doesn't listen to me. You're his father, you should be the one to talk to him." But Brian kept pushing, unwilling to take responsibility for the son he had coddled all his life. Brian often begged me not to be cold, insisting he wasn't good at handling tough conversations. But his constant nagging only deepened my disappointment. The very next day, he pressed again. "Have you talked to Jim about the money yet?" "What did he say?" When I admitted I hadn't, his anger flared. "What are you doing? You need to talk to him right away." His demands exhausted me. I no longer cared about Jim's finances, I cared only about uncovering the truth about Brian's affair. Still, to keep the peace, I approached Jim reluctantly. "Your father is worried about your spending," I said evenly. "He asked me to remind you to be more careful with money." Jim exploded instantly. "Who do you think you are, housekeeper? It's my money and I'll spend it however I want. None of your business." His fury showed me why Brian always avoided this conversation. Jim was impossible, and yet Brian continued to ignore his flaws while chasing another woman. Jim's eyes burned with hatred as he hissed, "I'll get you kicked out of this house." "Just wait." His threat stung, but I reminded myself that once I had proof of Brian's infidelity, I would leave on my own terms. A few days later, Emma called. "Mom, we have the proof. Can you meet us at a restaurant?" My heart raced. Was it true? Did Brian really betray me? When I arrived, Emma and Jack handed me a thick envelope. Inside was the investigator's report, Photos of Brian with a much younger woman, their arms entwined, their smiles full of deceit. They were even looking for a house together. Jack's face was serious. You need to divorce him right away. This woman is suspicious. She spends recklessly and may be seeing other men behind his back. She could take his money and leave him with nothing. The truth was undeniable. Brian had already fallen deep into her trap. They had even toured a wedding venue, and I knew I had to act before he tied himself to her completely. When I returned home, Brian and Jim were waiting in the living room. "Mary, come here. We need to talk," Brian said sternly. Jim smirked beside him, holding up a blurry photo. "You've been seeing a younger guy, haven't you? Dad caught you red-handed at a restaurant." I recognized the photo immediately. It was me with Jack. "That's Emma's fiancé," I said firmly. "And Emma was with us that day." But Brian refused to listen. "Jim caught you in the act. You've been cheating on me, haven't you? Leave this house. We'll deal with the divorce and the money later." I almost laughed at the arrogance. "All right," I said calmly. "I'll leave, but we will discuss divorce and finances properly." As I headed for the door, Jim shouted after me, "Make us dinner before you go." I'm hungry. Even at that moment, all he cared about was food. I ignored him and walked out, carrying the investigation report straight to Emma's house. 3 weeks passed before Brian finally reached out. His voice was clipped and uneasy over the phone. "Let's meet at the house," he said. "We need to discuss things." On the day of the meeting, I didn't go alone. I arrived with Emma, Jack, and our lawyer. The moment Brian saw us, his face drained of color. "Why didn't you come by yourself?" he stammered. "You never said I had to," I replied coolly. I couldn't help but notice how filthy the house had become in just 3 weeks without me. Even then, Brian tried to sneer. "Even with all these people, you'll still be paying alimony." I laughed bitterly. "I've done nothing wrong. You're the one who will be paying. Sign these." I slid the divorce papers across the table. Brian froze, pulling out the same blurry photo of me with Jack. "Why should I pay alimony? You're the one cheating." Our lawyer calmly laid the investigator's report in front of him. Page after page showed undeniable proof of his affair. Brian's face turned ashen, and Jim sat in silence, wide-eyed. "I can't pay alimony," Brian muttered. "I'm broke. I borrowed money for the wedding and the honeymoon." At that moment, Jim's real fears slipped out. "You're not really remarrying, are you?" "I don't want to lose half of Mom's inheritance." Brian shook his head. "I already spent all of it." Jim collapsed into his chair, disbelief etched across his face. "Dad, can't you lend me some money? You've got something left, right?" "I'm broke," Brian whispered again. I looked Jim squarely in the eye. "I've seen the debt notices in your room. At your age, still making your father's wife clean up after you, it's pathetic." Our lawyer pushed the final alimony documents toward Brian. Defeated, he signed them. Jack, unable to hold back, added, "I've heard your mistress has been spending your money on other men. She's using you." Brian's hands shook as he frantically dialed her number, but she didn't answer. His face went white with panic. "Mary, I'm sorry," he begged. "Don't leave us." Even Jim looked desperate. "Please stay. Dad's never home, and I'm tired of eating junk food." I shook my head. "Ask your father's new wife. You'll have a young housekeeper soon enough." And with that, I walked out for the last time. That same day, we went straight to City Hall and filed for divorce. I moved in with Emma and Jack. It was cramped at first, but we were already making plans to move to a larger home. A few weeks later, word spread, Brian's mistress had scammed him. She ran off with a large sum of money meant for a wedding that would never happen, leaving him drowning in debt. Not long after, Jim called me in desperation. "Mom, Dad moved out and I have nowhere to go. Please help me." I felt nothing but cold clarity. "I'm not your mother," I reminded him. "I divorced your father, and we're not related." When he kept harassing me, Jack stepped in and threatened to report him to the police. That finally silenced him. Life with Emma and Jack soon settled into peace. And then came the best news of all: Emma was pregnant. My heart swelled with joy at the thought of becoming a grandmother. For the first time in years, I felt free, loved, and hopeful. I vowed to cherish every moment ahead with the people who truly mattered. This story follows a woman whose marriage crumbles after discovering her husband Brian's infidelity and irresponsibility. Despite his attempts to manipulate her with false accusations and financial pressure, she stands her ground and exposes his lies with undeniable proof. Brian loses everything: his inheritance, his mistress, and even the respect of his own son, while she finds strength in walking away. The conclusion shows that betrayal can destroy those who choose deception, but it can also free those who choose courage. By cutting ties with a toxic marriage, the woman reclaims her independence and rebuilds her life with her daughter and son-in-law. The final twist, learning she will become a grandmother, symbolizes new beginnings and a brighter future. Ultimately, the story highlights that sometimes the end of one chapter opens the door to peace, love, and family bonds that truly matter. This story is fictionalized and created for awareness and entertainment. It does not promote infidelity or harmful behavior. Any similarity to real people or events is purely coincidental. If this story touched you, inspired you, or kept you hooked till the very end, make sure to subscribe for more real-life tales of love, betrayal, and redemption in 2025 and beyond. Every story carries a lesson worth remembering, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.